start our display, before we get to the Tiger, with one or two vehicles to put it in a bit of context. Now, when you think about it, this tank coming on now, 2 years before the Tiger was in operation, in fact 1.5 years before they were even actually building the first Tiger, this is what Britain was actually fielding on the field of battle. This is the Matilda I tank that was first designed in the middle of the 1930s as what was called an infantry support tank. And the idea was, things like World War I, a tank going ahead of the infantry to crush down barbed wire, with its machine guns suppress the enemy positions, and then your infantry were to follow on behind. So they didn't mind it being slow. It's actually got very thick armour on it, but with just that one machine gun, not much in the way of firepower. And even as this went into service, this Matilda I tank it was called, even as it went into service, they realised it's a bit of a tank on the cheap. So they start designing a better version, and that's called the Matilda II. And at the moment, our Matilda II is in the workshops. We're just starting a restoration programme on that vehicle. And again, if you're interested, we're going to be putting that restoration on our website online so you can see how that progresses. £5,000 each these tanks cost, including the development cost. And they make about 140 of them. And apart from one little moment of glory at the Battle of Arras in 1940, when Matilda I's and 18 Matilda II tanks attacked an advancing German column, that was... So that's an infantry tank. We follow it up with a Matilda II infantry tank, and then we come along with the Valentine, which is also supposed to be an infantry tank as well. The Valentine, though, is actually a fair bit faster than the Matilda II. It doesn't need speed, because again, infantry tank helping the infantry onto a position. They start with the Valentine having a 2-pounder gun. It's a vehicle that's actually put together by British. No one has to ask for it. But because they use components that they've had on other tanks, such as the suspension system, it's actually fairly reliable. And for a British tank at the time, that's quite extraordinary, because most of our tanks were notoriously unreliable early on in the war. Now, this particular example of the Valentine, it was made in Britain. Some Valentines, about 8,000 Valentines are made altogether. About 1,200 are made out in Canada. And most of those are actually shipped straight over to help the Red Army fight on the Eastern Front. The Valentine goes through a whole load of different marks, in other words, different improvements. And the one in front of you is a Mark 9. The first tank only had a 2-pounder gun on, that's about 40 millimetres. This one is a 6-pounder gun, 57 millimetres. That's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. And they made the turret larger so that they could get 3 guys in the turret rather than the 2 in the earlier models. And again, it's a tank that's often underrated in tank histories, because it's the one we made the most of in Britain in World War II. The Russian, and then later it was used for putting lots of other experimental or variant vehicles, bits on the top, bridge layers, flamethrowers, all sorts of things were done with the Valentine. The first floating tanks were actually Valentine conversions. Now, next one coming on, you can hear that lovely rumble. That engine in the back of this tank, this is the Comet tank. That engine finally gave British tanks a bit of welling so that they could be upped in weight and upped in speed. And that's the famous Rolls-Royce engine in the back that was in the Spitfire. It was called the Merlin. They derated it, they changed it a very little bit and then put it in a tank, and they called it the Meteor. And that gives the Comet that lovely rumbling sound because of that big engine in the back, hugely thirsty of course, being a petrol engine of that scale. But the Comet is what's called a cruiser tank. And the idea was the infantry tanks make the hole, and then the cruiser tanks were supposed to go through the gap. And early in the war, our cruiser tanks, again, they suffered from unreliability. But by the time the Comet's coming into service, in late 1944, at last we've got a good engine, and of course the most important thing on a tank, a gun. This is a shortened version of the famous 17-pounder gun we put on the Firefly. Now on this particular model, it's actually about 20% better than the standard 17 designed British ammunition, what they call the standard Sabo ammunition. That actually has better penetration than the famous Panzer tank of the German army with a 75mm gun. So at last we have, not 1944, in December of 1944, at last we've got a cruiser tank with enough firepower to take on some of those German vehicles. As they were issuing these tanks, the famous German attack at the Battle of the Bulge start, they didn't finish training on the tank, so they went to also, of course, the Israeli army has got versions of it converted. So a fantastically successful tank, just a bit too late to see action in the Second World War. Now the next tank coming on, again, bit of context. This one as well, this is the famous American Sherman tank. And from the Western Allies' point of view, this is the tank that basically saves our bacon. Our own tank industry, in 1940, we were building aeroplanes and bombers, obviously, to get back at the Germans, fighters to defend ourselves. Tanks fell in priority at the beginning of the war. And when the Americans come into the war in December of 1941, they've already sent engineers to Europe to look at what they think is going to be needed. The first tank they build, you can see in the museum, the M3 Grant tank, that has a 75mm howitzer in the hull and an armour-piercing high-velocity gun in the turret on the top. Now that was only an interim model. The tank they really wanted to build was this one, the Sherman. And the early models, if they started stopping their advances to engage with German tanks, he thought that was a waste of their talents. This particular Sherman, quite famous now, it's the one we lent to the Fury movie set, hence Fury on the barrel. It's the main tank, the hero tank as it were in the film. It's a later war Sherman, and the German goes through a number of improvements during its development. This one has a 76mm gun, high velocity gun, twin diesel engine in the back, thicker armour, wider tracks, and a key thing for the crew, it has what they call wet stowage. In other words, the actual ammunition is now surrounded in its stowage compartments by water. Or one Panzer II, it was the tanks the German army built to start training with. Panzer III, Panzer IVs is what the German army wanted to go to war with. And they are beautifully engineered, fantastically well-made vehicles. When this Panzer III was captured, one of the steroids. Now, I'll let the Tiger run round and you can just have a listen to it.